By the summer of 1940, the sky above Britain was a battlefield. The German Luftwaffe, led by the formidable Bf 109 and Focke-Wulf 190, had established unquestionable dominance. Day after day, their planes cut through the clouds, striking fear into the hearts of the British Royal Air Force and the civilian population alike. The Germans, so sure of their aerial superiority, believed that control of the skies was an unchallenged prelude to victory. For the Allies, the reality was grim. They were losing the fight for survival, and the shadow of the Luftwaffes might seem to darken every horizon. In the heart of this crisis, the Luftwaffe's belief in their own invincibility grew. Their arrogance was palpable. Their planes were swift, nimble, and deadly, qualities that made them an ideal match for the high-stakes dogfights that defined the Battle of Britain. To them, air superiority wasn't just an advantage, it was a foregone conclusion. But in the midst of this aerial dominance, a new challenger was on the horizon. It wasn't the sleek, fast fighter that many had expected, but a behemoth, the P-47 Thunderbolt. At first glance, the Thunderbolt seemed unfit for the fight. It was large, cumbersome, and its speed was far from the agility of the German fighters. It was dismissed by many as a relic, a misstep in design, a plane that could not possibly stand against the speed and precision of the Luftwaffe's finest. Commanders looked at the Thunderbolt with skepticism, questioning how a plane of its size, which struggled to keep pace with the more agile German aircraft, could possibly make a difference. But what they didn't know was that the weapon they mocked would soon erase their advantage entirely. The Thunderbolt, with its durability and sheer firepower, would soon reveal itself to be an adversary the Germans never expected. What began as a prototype aircraft dismissed by many would, against all odds, become the backbone of the Allied air forces and shift the momentum of the war in the skies. In the coming months, this oversized fighter would prove that strength could conquer speed, and the battle for the skies was far from over. In an airfield far from the front lines, engineers were already working on modifications that would soon push the Thunderbolt to its limits, changing everything. In the early days of 1939, the world was on the brink of a storm, and the skies would soon become a battleground like no other. The United States, eager to bolster its defenses in the face of growing global tension, sought a solution to protect its bombers from the increasingly deadly threat of enemy fighters. The answer, they believed, lay in the creation of a new fighter, one that could endure, survive, and protect at all costs. And so the P-47 Thunderbolt was born. Designed with a heavy armament and a large, imposing frame, the Thunderbolt was a departure from the sleek, agile fighters of the day. To many, it seemed impractical. Its size alone suggested that it was an unfit contender in the rapidly evolving landscape of aerial warfare. Where speed and maneuverability had become the hallmarks of success, the Thunderbolt appeared slow and cumbersome, a heavy-handed response to a nimble enemy. Some commanders were skeptical, doubting its ability to hold its own against the sleek Bf 109s and Focke-Wulf 190s that dominated the skies. Yet the engineers behind the Thunderbolt believed otherwise. They saw potential in the plane's durability. It was designed not just to outfly the enemy, but to outlast them. With its robust frame and formidable armament, the Thunderbolt could absorb hits that would cripple lesser planes. In a time when the Allies desperately needed something capable of enduring the brutal realities of aerial combat, the Thunderbolt's resilience was its greatest asset. As the engineers prepared for the first test flights, the doubts lingered. Would this oversized fighter be too slow to be effective in the fast-paced dogfights that defined the battle for the skies? The first flights seemed promising, but even then, uncertainty remained. Yet with each passing test, the Thunderbolt's strength and ruggedness became undeniable. Soon, the very flaws that had been dismissed as weaknesses became the Thunderbolt's greatest virtues. Its firepower, its ability to take a beating and keep fighting, would soon prove to be exactly what the Allies needed in their struggle for victory. But as the plane gained favor, a new challenge was emerging. Could it be adapted to meet the brutal demands of war in Europe? By 1942, the war in Europe had reached a grim impasse. The Allies, though determined, found themselves continually outmatched in the skies. Despite their best efforts and mounting sacrifices, air superiority remained firmly in German hands. The Luftwaffe, with its swift Bf 109s and deadly Focke-Wulf 190s, seemed unstoppable. Every Allied attempt to wrest control from the German pilots ended in catastrophic losses. The relentless grind of aerial combat felt like a desperate chase, with the Allies falling further behind in the race for dominance. And yet, The cost of failure weighed heavily on those in command. Commanders, faced with mounting losses, began to question traditional air tactics. They knew something had to change, but what? The tools of war were no longer enough. Old methods had failed, and new strategies were required, strategies that could break the pattern of loss and give the Allies a fighting chance. Enter the P-47 Thunderbolt. But even as the Thunderbolt made its combat debut, it quickly became clear that the battle would not be easy. The aircraft, massive and bulky, struggled to match the speed and agility of the German fighters. In the tight, fast-moving aerial duels over Europe, the Thunderbolt seemed at a severe disadvantage. It lacked the nimbleness to dance around the Luftwaffe's best. And yet, in the face of these harsh realities, a critical shift began to take place. What had once been seen as a weakness, the Thunderbolt's size, was now being recognized as its greatest strength. Its larger frame, while making it less maneuverable, allowed it to take damage that would have crippled other fighters. It could absorb hits, continue to fight, and still complete its mission. That resilience, its ability to endure the brutality of aerial combat, became the Thunderbolt's defining feature. The P-47 Thunderbolt was not the fastest. It was not the most agile. But what it lacked in speed, it made up for in raw firepower and a sheer toughness that no German fighter could match. The war had begun with overwhelming odds, but with the Thunderbolt in the air, the Allies now had an aircraft capable of turning the tide. The real question, however, was whether the Allies would recognize the true potential of the Thunderbolt before it was too late. By the summer of 1943, the P-47 Thunderbolt had made its way into larger combat operations, but its reception remained far from certain. High-ranking commanders, skeptical of its true capabilities, watched with a cautious eye. The Thunderbolt, they believed, was still too slow. Its bulk, which had once been considered a glaring flaw, now seemed like a critical disadvantage in the fast-paced, maneuver-heavy world of dogfights. The German Luftwaffe's fighters were agile and quick, traits that made them formidable opponents in the skies. The P-47, in their eyes, could never keep pace. Despite these misgivings, the Thunderbolt was thrust into the heat of battle, primarily in the role of protecting bomber formations. At first, its performance was met with uncertainty, but soon its worth became undeniable. The P-47, though not a nimble dogfighter, showed its true power in the heat of combat. It was designed not to outmaneuver the enemy, but to outlast them. With its massive frame and heavy firepower, it could protect the bombers it was assigned to, fending off the Luftwaffe's most dangerous interceptors. While its competitors swooped and darted with speed, the Thunderbolt remained a constant, an indomitable presence in the sky, absorbing the blows that would have crippled other aircraft. Ironically, the very qualities that had once been dismissed as flaws, its size, its armament, its ability to absorb hits, were now emerging as its greatest strengths. The Thunderbolt wasn't a fighter meant for the swift, close-quarters engagements of a dogfight. No, it was built for endurance, for battle over long distances, for sustaining the violence of combat without faltering. And in that role it excelled. The P-47 had found its true purpose not as a dogfighter, but as an essential bomber escort and a brutal force in ground attack missions. The turning point came after its first successful engagement. The Thunderbolt had proven its value, not only in protecting vital bombers, but in creating a protective shield that allowed the Allied forces to conduct their missions with greater freedom. What had once seemed like a slow, cumbersome behemoth now revealed itself as a relentless, indestructible weapon. Still, not all commanders were convinced. Some saw the P-47 size as a flaw that could limit its effectiveness in the long term. They believed that a slower, heavier aircraft couldn't be relied upon for sustained success in a rapidly evolving war. Yet, as the months wore on, fewer and fewer commanders held these doubts. The Thunderbolt, though slower than its counterparts, had shown itself to be built for the long haul. It was not a plane for fleeting skirmishes, but one for relentless, unyielding combat. And as the Allies began to trust the Thunderbolt's potential, the course of the war in the skies began to shift. But as the Thunderbolt proved its value, a new challenge loomed. Could it maintain its place in a world that increasingly demanded speed and agility above all else? The answer, it seemed, was about to come from an unexpected source. By late 1943, the tide of war had shifted, but the Allies' grip on the skies was still tenuous at best. The Luftwaffe, though increasingly stretched thin, still posed a formidable threat. As the Allies pushed deeper into German-held territories, air superiority remained elusive. The skies were a vast expanse of uncertainty, filled with the constant hum of engines and the shriek of bullets. For all their advancements, the Allies had not yet achieved the dominance they so desperately needed. But in this moment of struggle, the P-47 Thunderbolt, once thought to be an unfit contender, was emerging as a key player in the conflict. The Thunderbolt's bulk, once seen as a weakness, was now being leveraged in ways that no one had imagined. With its capacity to carry heavy payloads and perform devastating ground attacks, the Thunderbolt began to prove its worth in ways far beyond its original design. It became more than just a bomber escort. It became a tool of destruction in its own right, capable of turning the battlefield into a wasteland. German ground forces, once confident in their position, now found themselves under constant assault. The Thunderbolt's precision strikes on strategic targets wreaked havoc, crippling supply lines and disrupting vital infrastructure. In every explosion, the Allies grew closer to victory. As the Thunderbolt's role expanded, so too did the tactics employed by its crews. Pilots, who had initially been skeptical of the aircraft's weight and speed, began to understand its true value. They adapted their strategies, utilizing the Thunderbolt's resilience to execute precision ground strikes that other, more agile fighters could not manage. The aircraft's ability to absorb damage and keep fighting made it the ideal platform for these dangerous missions. It could take hits that would cripple lighter fighters and still return home to fight another day. The turning point came when the Thunderbolt's success became undeniable. No longer just a protector of bombers, it had become a cornerstone of the Allied air strategy in Europe. It was a force that could handle everything, from high-altitude bomber defense to low-level strafing runs that decimated German forces below. The P-47 had earned its place as a game-changer in the skies, and the morale of the pilots reflected that shift. The once skeptical crews now sang the Thunderbolt's praises. Its unmatched toughness and firepower had made it a fighter that was as unrelenting as the war itself. As the Allies pushed forward, the question that remained was whether the Thunderbolt could sustain its dominance. In the face of ever-changing tactics and the brutal demands of warfare, would the Thunderbolt's resilience continue to give it an edge? The answer was not clear, but one thing was certain. The P-47 had already changed the course of the war, and it would continue to shape the skies of Europe for months to come. In the coming weeks, a new wave of challenges would test the Thunderbolt in ways its creators never imagined. Would it evolve to meet those challenges, or would it falter under the weight of the war's ever-growing demands? By 1944, the P-47 Thunderbolt had become an essential part of the Allied arsenal. It had weathered the harshest tests and emerged as an overwhelming force in the skies. Yet despite its proven effectiveness, doubts lingered. Some still believed that faster, more agile aircraft, like the British Spitfire or the sleek German jets, would ultimately outperform the Thunderbolt in the long term. The P-47, after all, had never been designed to be a nimble dogfighter. Its size and bulk were viewed by many as limiting factors in a fast-evolving war where speed was becoming a defining advantage. But as the Allies pushed further into German territory, it became increasingly clear that the Thunderbolt was not just surviving, it was thriving. As the Allies made their relentless advance into Germany, the Thunderbolt was pushed to its limits. Its durability, once seen as a curiosity, was now its defining feature. The skies above Europe were growing more dangerous by the day, and the P-47's resilience was about to face its greatest test. Every mission seemed to stretch the aircraft further than before, longer distances, more intense air combat, and ever-increasing numbers of German fighters and flak batteries. The Thunderbolt's engines roared across the skies, its wings battered by the constant onslaught, yet it pressed on. The aircraft wasn't just built to fight, it was built to endure. But how much longer could it hold up? The irony of the Thunderbolt's journey was not lost on those who had once dismissed it as an oversized, outdated relic. What had been labeled a failure had now become a machine of almost unimaginable endurance. The P-47 had proven itself again and again, adapting to the ever-evolving needs of the Allies. It had shifted roles multiple times, from bomber escort to ground attack platform, and had excelled at each. Now, as the war drew closer to its final act, the Thunderbolt was being tested. In ways its creators had never envisioned, but it rose to the occasion every time. In response to these growing demands, workshops around the world mobilized. The P-47 was mass-produced and constantly modified to extend its capabilities. Longer missions, greater payloads, and improved fuel efficiency were prioritized. The demand for the Thunderbolt skyrocketed as the Allies intensified their offensive. Yet with every new modification, the pressure mounted. Could the Thunderbolt continue to perform under such intense strain? Could it maintain its place as the cornerstone of the Allied air strategy? The answer, it seemed, was yes. The P-47, a machine originally designed for a very different type of war, had become a symbol of endurance and ingenuity. It was a weapon built not for speed, but for survival, a machine that could endure the chaos of combat and return time and again to fight. In a war that demanded resilience more than anything else, the Thunderbolt was the perfect weapon. Yet as the war neared its end, one question still loomed. Could the P adapt one final time to meet the challenges of the next phase of the conflict? The answer would come in the most unexpected of places. By 1944, the war had entered its most grueling phase. The Allies' push into Germany was relentless, but so too was the toll it took on both men and machines. Convoys moved under the cover of night, their engines humming through a landscape shrouded in darkness, rain, and fog. The battlefields were no longer confined to the sky. They had become an unforgiving expanse of earth and air, where every second mattered and every moment held the possibility of death. For the P-47 Thunderbolt, this new phase of the war would test its durability in ways that no one had foreseen. The elements were as much a foe as the Luftwaffe itself. Pilots found themselves flying through relentless rainstorms, their cockpits fogging up as temperatures plummeted. Ice formed on wings, making every maneuver a calculated risk. The thunderous roar of the engines had to cut through the howling winds and battering rain, as each aircraft pressed forward despite the brutal conditions. The P-47, designed for a different kind of war, was now being pushed to its limits. It wasn't built for such extremes, but it was about to show the Allies that it could endure in ways its designers had never imagined. In this environment, the P-47's resilience would become its greatest asset. Calhoun, one of the aircraft's early engineers, had made modifications to the engine and cooling systems long before the war had reached this point. Those changes, which were once considered small adjustments, now proved invaluable. The modifications allowed the Thunderbolt to continue operating through long shifts, even in the most punishing conditions. While other aircraft faltered, struggling with the elements, the Thunderbolt kept its engines running. For the crews on the ground, it meant they could rely on their machines when everything else seemed to be falling apart. Adaptation became the key to survival. Pilots and ground crews, seasoned by months of combat, developed new techniques for keeping the Thunderbolts in the air. They learned how to maintain and repair the planes in field conditions, often under fire, in weather that made every task a race against time. What had once been considered the P-47's greatest weaknesses, the heavy build, the clunky design, were now seen as strengths. Its ruggedness, its ability to take a beating and still fight on, became the cornerstone of its performance. Pilots no longer saw the Thunderbolt as a machine of mere power. They saw it as a lifeline, a tool that could withstand the endless demands of a war that showed no signs of slowing down. The irony was profound. What had once been derided as a slow, unwieldy fighter was now the backbone of the Allies' air operations in Europe. The P-47's power, its brute strength, and its unyielding toughness made it the ideal weapon for sustained, grueling combat. While other aircraft might have faltered, the Thunderbolt kept fighting. It wasn't the fastest, nor the most agile, but it had the one quality that the war demanded above all: endurance. And in a war that seemed to stretch on endlessly, the ability to endure became the greatest asset of all. As the days bled into nights, fatigue began to take its toll on the men in the cockpit. Pilots, drained from countless hours in the air, faced exhaustion that threatened to cripple their will. Yet in those darkest moments, they found strength in the Thunderbolt. It wasn't just a machine. It had become a symbol of their own ability to endure. As long as the Thunderbolt could keep flying, they could keep fighting. The belief in their aircraft became a source of resilience, a flicker of light in the shadow of war. The true revelation of the P-47's success lay not just in its firepower or its capacity to destroy. It was in its ability to adapt to thrive under condition. That would break other planes. It was in its relentless endurance, the refusal to be defeated by exhaustion, weather, or mechanical failure. The Thunderbolt had become more than just a weapon. It had become a symbol of survival itself. In the hellish skies above Europe, the P-47 had proven that sometimes the greatest strength is the ability to keep going when everything else seems to be falling apart. Yet as the war entered its final stages, a question remained. Would the P-47 be able to continue its endurance into the final, decisive moments of the war? The answer would come, not from the machines themselves, but from the men who flew them. The struggle for survival was far from over, and the P-47, as it had done so many times before, would meet the challenge head-on. In a hangar deep behind enemy lines, another set of engineers was already working on a new challenge, one that would test the Thunderbolt's endurance yet again. By September 1944, the war in Europe had reached a critical juncture. The Allies, having secured a foothold in Normandy, began their relentless push into France. The front lines were advancing with brutal force, but beneath the roar of tanks and the march of infantry, another battle was being fought, one in the skies. As the Allies pushed deeper into German-held territory, the P-47 Thunderbolt emerged as the backbone of their air operations, clearing the skies and providing the critical air support needed to sustain the ground advance. But the logistical challenges were immense. While tanks rumbled across the earth and infantry pressed forward, the supply lines, the lifeblood of the campaign, struggled to keep pace. Fuel, ammunition, and vital supplies were needed in vast quantities, and every mile gained on the ground was a mile further from the supply depots. The roads, clogged with military convoys, were under constant threat from German bombers and fighters. The Allies needed more than just ground forces. They needed air superiority to ensure the safe movement of supplies and troops. And in this moment of critical need, the P-47 stepped in to fulfill its role, not just as a fighter, but as a guardian of the supply lines. The irony of the situation was striking. While tanks and infantry took the visible glory on the front lines, it was the P-47s, often overlooked as mere brute machines, that ensured the Allies could continue to push forward. Their role was not glamorous, but it was essential. The Thunderbolts flew day after day, sweeping the skies clear of enemy fighters and bombers, allowing the ground forces to advance without constant interference from the Luftwaffe. With their heavy firepower and indomitable resilience, the P-47s kept the air above France secure, ensuring the safe passage of critical supplies to the front lines. The Thunderbolts flew with astonishing efficiency. They delivered bombs on enemy positions, strafed supply depots, and provided air cover for advancing troops. In the midst of chaos and destruction, the P-47s operated with the precision of a finely tuned machine, each mission a crucial step forward in the battle for France. Their presence allowed the Allies to maintain the momentum they needed to break the German defensive lines. Without them, the war would have slowed to a crawl, bogged down by the constant threat of German air superiority. But the cost of this success was heavy. The P-47s, already battered from months of combat, were now subjected to even more strain. The relentless demands of the campaign, the constant takeoffs and landings, the battles in the skies, all of it took its toll. Mechanical attrition set in, and the planes required constant maintenance. Yet, despite the wear and tear, the P-47s continued to perform. Their heavy armor, their powerful engines, and their rugged design made them the perfect tool for the mission at hand. The Thunderbolts flew into battle with an almost uncanny ability to endure, delivering strike after strike, returning to base with their engines humming, ready to fly again. It was during this period that the Allies realized a critical truth. Air supremacy and logistical support were just as vital to victory as the ground battles themselves. The P-47 had proven that the skies could not be ignored. The movement of supplies, the protection of convoys, the disruption of enemy air operations, all of these were just as crucial as the battles being fought on the ground. The P-47 had become indispensable to the Allied advance. It was not just a fighter. It was the weapon that kept the war machine moving, that ensured the Allies could continue to press their advantage and push the Germans back. The turning point had come. The Allies understood now that air superiority, once thought of as a secondary concern, was in fact the artery that kept the war effort alive. The P-47, with its heavy firepower and remarkable durability, was the perfect weapon to secure that supremacy. It had proven time and again that it could endure, and it could take on whatever the war demanded and still return to the fight. The Thunderbolt had become not just a plane, but a symbol of endurance, of resilience in the face of overwhelming odds. As the Allies moved closer to victory, the question remained: would the P-47 continue to evolve to meet the new challenges ahead? Its power and toughness had brought the Allies this far, but could it withstand the final push to defeat Germany? In the heart of the French countryside, the P-47s continued to take off, their engines roaring as they ascended into the skies. But beyond the battlefields, another challenge was emerging, one that would require the Thunderbolt to adapt once more. Would it rise to the occasion, or would it be surpassed by new technologies? Only time would tell. Winter 1944 had settled over Europe like a relentless, unforgiving blanket. The war, which had been burning hot through summer and fall, now ground to a brutal, icy crawl. The German forces launched a major offensive in the Ardennes, known as the Battle of the Bulge, and once again the P-47 Thunderbolt was called to provide air support for the Allies. But this time, the conditions were different. The biting cold, the snow that blanketed the landscape, and the fog that could swallow entire squadrons of aircraft. It was an environment that even the Thunderbolt, with its unparalleled durability, would struggle to overcome. The struggle now was not just against the enemy, but against the conditions themselves. The P-47s, their engines roaring through the frigid air, found themselves up against the harshest winter weather that Europe had ever seen. The mechanical systems, already stressed from months of combat, now froze in the cold, oil thickening to the point of near solidification. Pilots, their breath misting in the cockpit, fought not only the enemy but the unrelenting chill that seeped into their bones. The aircraft's heavy design, once a strength, now became a burden, as the freezing temperatures created new challenges for every mission. Yet, despite these harsh realities, the Thunderbolt kept flying. With every mission, it delivered crucial air support, ensuring that the Allies would not falter in their fight against the Germans. Fatigue quickly became a silent, deadly companion for the pilots. Long shifts, freezing cold, and constant exposure to the elements took their toll. Mechanical breakdowns became more frequent as the wear on the aircraft increased exponentially. But it was not just the planes that were breaking down. The pilots, too, felt the weight of their exhaustion. They pushed through the pain, through the sleepless nights, and the days that seemed to drag on forever, but it was clear that something had to give. The endless cycle of takeoff, combat, and landing, followed by rushed repairs, was beginning to eat away at the very fabric of the Allied war effort. The strain was visible in every squadron, in every face of the men who had been flying for months on end, often without respite. Ironically, even as the P-47s were pushed to their breaking point by the harsh winter, they continued to deliver. The Thunderbolt, once mocked for its size and lack of agility, had proven itself time and again. Now, in the depths of winter, its durability was the deciding factor in ensuring the Allies' ability to continue their offensive. The P-47s plowed through the frigid skies, their engines sputtering and their wings caked in ice, yet they kept fighting. In the face of mechanical failure and fatigue, they still delivered vital air support to the front lines. The Luftwaffe, though still a formidable force, could not match the Thunderbolt's endurance. Where speed and agility had once been the key to survival, it was now strength and staying power that determined victory. As the war wore on, the engineers and ground crews knew that every day could be their last. The planes needed constant maintenance, and it wasn't just the P-47s that were struggling. It was every aspect of the war effort. To keep up with the demand for air support, adjustments had to be made to the Thunderbolts, often under harrowing conditions. Mechanics worked tirelessly in freezing temperatures, making last-minute fixes and ensuring that the planes could fly one more mission. The heavy work of the crews, often done without proper shelter, was becoming just as important as the work in the cockpit. In the face of constant breakdowns and cold-induced failures, they adapted, modifying the aircraft's engines and fueling systems to withstand the bitter conditions. But the cost of victory was becoming painfully clear. The relentless nature of the war, combined with the harsh conditions, led to an unspoken truth. More casualties resulted from exhaustion and mechanical failure than from enemy fire itself. The road, it seemed, would eat everything in its path, men and machines alike. And while the P-47s were still flying, still fighting, their resilience was beginning to show. Its limits, the men who flew them and the planes that carried them were being worn down by a war that seemed endless in its demand for endurance. And yet there was a quiet revelation amidst this struggle. It wasn't just the Thunderbolt's firepower that had made it invaluable. It was its ability to keep fighting despite these harsh challenges. The P-47 had proven time and again that its durability was as vital as its guns. As the Allies closed in on their final victory, the question remained, would the Thunderbolt's endurance carry them through to the very end? And if so, how much more could it take before the road itself claimed its final toll? The answer, like the end of the war, was still unknown. But one thing was certain: the Thunderbolt's ability to endure would shape the final moments of the conflict. It had become more than just a fighter. It had become a symbol of the strength needed to carry on, no matter what the cost. By the fall of 1944, the war had reached a critical moment. The Allies, despite their successes, found themselves at a crossroads, one where the outcome of the war could pivot on a single, high-stakes operation. Operation Market Garden, the ambitious plan to push deep into the Netherlands and seize key bridges, would require an unprecedented logistical effort. To ensure the success of this bold move, every aspect of the operation would need to fall into place, especially the supply lines. And in this moment of dire necessity, it was the P-47 Thunderbolts that would shoulder the weight of the mission, proving once again that their value extended far beyond the skies. The struggle was immediate and immense. The demands placed on the Thunderbolts skyrocketed almost overnight. What had been a steady stream of air support was now transformed into a full-scale logistical operation. The P-47s were called upon to deliver more resources than ever before. Ammunition, food, medical supplies, everything that could keep the Allied forces moving forward had to be flown in, often under the most difficult conditions. As the operation pressed on, the Thunderbolts continued to perform with astonishing resilience. The weather, which had already been harsh, grew colder, with rain turning to snow, and the skies filling with low-hanging clouds. But despite these challenges, the Thunderbolts' durability proved indispensable. Innovation became a key factor in the success of Operation Market Garden. The engineers and ground crews worked tirelessly, making last-minute modifications to the Thunderbolts. Their ability to adapt quickly ensured that the planes could continue to operate under the mounting pressure. The P-47s, heavy and rugged, were designed to endure, but this was something new entirely. The supply runs became more frequent, and the stakes higher with each passing day. The Thunderbolts, with their ability to absorb punishment and keep flying, were the perfect aircraft to meet this challenge. Their endurance had always been a hallmark, but now it was being tested to the breaking point. As the Germans launched counterattacks and raids in an attempt to disrupt the Allies' supply routes, the Thunderbolts remained unshaken. The Luftwaffe, though depleted, still posed a formidable threat. But the P-47s kept the skies clear, protecting the vital air supply lines that were the lifeblood of Operation Market Garden. The P-47s, once considered too slow and cumbersome for such an operation, now proved themselves to be the backbone of the Allied effort. Every mission, whether a bombing run, an escort, or a supply drop, became a testament to the Thunderbolts' strength and reliability. The Germans could not interrupt the flow of supplies. The P-47s ensured that nothing stood between the Allies and their objective. The irony of the situation was not lost on the men who had first doubted the Thunderbolt. What had once seemed like a desperate gamble, a reliance on a plane that was too large and slow to be effective in the fast-moving world of war, had now become a turning point in the conflict. The P-47, with its unyielding toughness and adaptability, had become more than just a fighter. It was a symbol of resilience, a machine capable of delivering victory against all odds. The very qualities that had once been dismissed as flaws, its bulk, its inability to maneuver like the more nimble fighters, were now the reasons it could succeed where others could not. And then, in the midst of all this, the turning point came. The P-47s delivered the critical supplies that kept the operation alive longer than anyone had anticipated. The Allies, who had feared that the operation might fail due to logistical issues, now found themselves able to press forward, their front lines pushing deeper into enemy territory. The Thunderbolts, in their seemingly endless flights through cold, fog, and smoke, had not only kept the mission alive, they had made it possible. It was in this moment that a revelation dawned. The true key to the Allies' success, it seemed, lay not just in firepower but in logistics. The ability to sustain an army with food, ammunition, and supplies was just as vital as the ability to defeat the enemy. The P-47s, once regarded as mere bombers and escorts, had proven that they were capable of far more than that. They were the lifeblood of the operation, the unseen force that kept everything moving forward. In the days that followed, the Allies' ability to sustain their momentum became the deciding factor in their success. The P-47, which had been a symbol of endurance and raw power, had become the symbol of logistical triumph. The operation was far from over, and the war still raged, but in that moment it became clear that the Allies had found a new strength, one that went beyond the battlefield. The P-47s had given them the means to continue fighting, to push forward in the face of exhaustion, cold, and enemy resistance. But as the war continued to escalate, one question remained. Would the P-47 continue to serve as the cornerstone of Allied air operations, or would new challenges, perhaps even new technologies, eventually force it into the shadows of history? The next chapter was already beginning to unfold, and the Thunderbolt would have to prove once again that it could adapt and endure, whatever came next. As winter 1944 stretched into 1945, the war seemed to have entered its final, most brutal phase. The Allies, having secured a tenuous foothold in the heart of Europe, were pushing relentlessly toward the heart of Germany. The Red Ball Express, the vital logistical lifeline ferrying supplies to the front lines, was stretched further than ever before. Every inch of ground gained had to be held, and every supply run had to reach its destination. The P-47 Thunderbolt, that workhorse of the skies, found itself once again thrust into a critical role. As the stakes grew higher, the demands on the Thunderbolts became almost unbearable. The struggle was relentless. The P-47s, already showing signs of wear from months of continuous combat, were pushed to their breaking point. Their engines, which had once roared with strength, now sputtered and strained under the weight of the mission. The demands of the Red Ball Express, coupled with the harsh winter conditions, placed unprecedented stress on the aircraft. As the Thunderbolts flew through snow and freezing fog, their frames groaned with the pressure. Mechanical breakdowns became increasingly frequent. Engines that once ran with power now faltered, unable to keep up with the demand for constant sorties. Yet, despite the toll on the machines themselves, the P-47s continued to fly. They delivered vital air support, cleared enemy positions, and ensured the flow of supplies, each mission a small miracle of endurance. The irony was undeniable. The aircraft that had once been dismissed as too slow, too cumbersome, and too unwieldy had, by this point in the war, proven itself indispensable. Where faster, more agile planes struggled to keep pace with the demands of sustained combat, the P-47s, large, powerful, and unyielding, had become the backbone of the Allied air campaign. What had initially been seen as a weakness, their bulk, was now their greatest strength. Their ability to absorb hits, to keep flying through the harshest conditions, and to deliver devastating blows to the enemy made them the perfect tool for a war that was being fought not on speed, but on resilience. With every mission, the morale of the troops was bolstered by the reliability of the Thunderbolts. The P-47s, despite their wear, kept the air cleared of enemy bombers, delivered bombs with precision on entrenched positions, and ensured that the supply lines, vital arteries of the war effort, remained intact. The Allies, exhausted and stretched thin, found in the Thunderbolts a symbol of perseverance. The plane that had once been mocked now stood as a symbol of hope, its heavy engines and relentless durability providing the strength the Allies needed to keep pushing forward. It became clear that the P-47's perseverance was more than just an asset, it was the key to maintaining momentum. The battles were no longer fought just on the ground or in the sky. They were fought in the logistics, in the unyielding flow of supplies that could not stop, no matter how dire the circumstances. The Thunderbolts kept the front line alive despite the overwhelming odds. They became more than mere fighters. They became a lifeline, allowing the Allies to continue their advance into the heart of Germany, where victory seemed both tantalizingly close and impossibly far away. The turning point came in early 1945, when the Allies, having pushed through the dense forests of the Ardennes, began their final push into Germany. The P-47s, despite their wear, were there, delivering air support, attacking supply depots, clearing enemy positions, and ensuring that the final push could continue without faltering. The Thunderbolts flew missions at all hours, our engines whining against the freezing air as they streaked across the skies of Europe. These were no longer the sleek, fast dogfights that had once defined aerial combat. These were brutal, grinding missions of attrition, where only the most durable and the most relentless could succeed. And the P-47, with its powerful guns and impenetrable armor, proved that it could not only survive but thrive in this unforgiving environment. By the time the Allies entered the heart of Germany, the P-47 had become a symbol of everything the war effort had been about: endurance, resilience, and the refusal to quit. It had carried the Allies through some of their darkest days, and now, at the threshold of victory, it was clear that its contribution had been as crucial as any other. The P-47 had become more than just a fighter plane. It had become a testament to the power of perseverance. But as the Allies neared the final victory, one question remained. How much longer could the P-47 endure? Could the Thunderbolt continue to serve its purpose as the war wound to a close? Or would new technologies, new aircraft, and new strategies render it obsolete? The answer was just on the horizon, but for now, the P-47's place in history was secure. It had become the symbol of a war that had tested every man, every machine, and every strategy. It had shown that the road would break before the men did. And in the end, that resilience, that ability to keep fighting no matter the cost, would prove to be the key to victory. December 1944. The war in Europe had reached a bitter and decisive crossroads. The Allies, stretched thin across the continent, were faced with a German offensive that seemed to threaten everything they had gained. The Battle of the Bulge, Hitler's last major push, was unfolding in the Ardennes. With German forces threatening to encircle and cut off the Allied armies, General Patton's counterattack was the key to stopping the siege and preserving the momentum of the Allied advance. But Patton's forces would need more than infantry and tanks. They needed a lifeline from the skies. It was here that the P-47 Thunderbolts, the unassuming giants of the war effort, would make their mark. The struggle for Patton's forces was immense. The weather was bitterly cold, the ground frozen, and the roads clogged with vehicles and troops. In the face of a rapidly advancing enemy, the logistics of moving supplies, reinforcements, and equipment became almost as important as the battles being fought on the ground. The P-47s, once relegated to bomber escort, now found themselves delivering crucial air support for the counteroffensive. Every gallon of fuel delivered, every bomb dropped, every burst of gunfire aimed at the advancing German positions became a lifeline for Patton's army. The Thunderbolts were the key to ensuring that the flow of supplies and support continued without interruption. And with each mission, they did more than just protect the ground forces. They became the backbone of Patton's counterattack. The irony of this moment was profound. The P-47s, once dismissed for their size and heavy frame, had evolved into the crucial element of the Allied strategy. Where once the Thunderbolt had been seen as slow and unwieldy, it was now recognized for its ability to endure, to deliver payloads with deadly accuracy, and to keep the enemy at bay long enough to allow Patton's forces to push forward. What had been considered a cumbersome design became a symbol of resilience and reliability. The Thunderbolt, far from being a weak link, had proven itself to be the most vital asset in the fight for Europe's future. Its robust engines and unrelenting power made it the perfect instrument for an offensive that relied just as much on logistics and air superiority as it did on ground combat. As the P-47s continued their sorties, the turning point came into sharper focus. The German siege, once thought insurmountable, began to falter. The P-47s had cleared the skies, ensured the safe delivery of supplies, and struck key German positions that would have otherwise impeded the Allied advance. With each passing day, Patton's forces found themselves able to push the German lines back, breaking through the encirclement. The Battle of the Bulge, which had threatened to unravel the Allied push into Germany, was now turning in favor of the Allies. And at the heart of this victory were the P-47 Thunderbolts, silent yet relentless, flying over the frozen battlefield and delivering their deadly cargo without hesitation. The moral victory of the P-47's role in this counterattack extended far beyond the battlefield. It wasn't just the raw power of the Thunderbolts that had ensured victory. It was the logistical support they provided that had proven to be the true weapon of war. It became clear that, in the final stages of the conflict, logistics and air superiority were just as critical to victory as firepower on the ground. The P-47s had demonstrated that air superiority wasn't just about destroying enemy aircraft. It was about ensuring that the war machine could keep moving, that the flow of supplies and reinforcements could continue without faltering. In this light, the P-47's contribution to the final push against the German forces became undeniable. Without their tireless missions to clear supply routes and strike at the heart of enemy positions, the road to victory would have been much longer. The Battle of the Bulge might have dragged on, stalling the Allied advance at a crucial moment. But the Thunderbolts, in their relentless drive, ensured that Patton's counterattack was a success, giving the Allies the momentum they needed to continue their march toward Berlin. As the Allies continued their drive toward victory, the question arose: could the P maintain its dominance, or would new threats, new technologies, and new strategies render it obsolete? The answer was not yet clear, but what was certain was that, without the Thunderbolt, the Allied victory in Europe would have been much harder to achieve. The P-47, the unexpected hero, had not only helped secure victory, it had become the linchpin of the Allied war effort in the final stages of the conflict. And as the final days of the war in Europe began to unfold, the relentless P-47s kept flying, pushing ever closer to the moment that would change the course of history. But what they didn't know was that the weapon they mocked, once thought of as too slow and too bulky, would soon become the very thing that would define the end of the war. The road to victory was not over, and the P-47 would once again rise to meet the challenge. By the spring of 1945, the end of the war in Europe was in sight. The Allies, having endured years of bloody combat, were marching into Germany. The skies above, once fiercely contested, were now cleared of enemy aircraft, and the land below was marked by the advancing armies. It was a moment of triumph, a culmination of sacrifice, strategy, and for some, an unsung hero, the P-47 Thunderbolt. As the victory bells rang and the front lines shifted toward Berlin, the legacy of the P-47 had already been cemented, but not in the way one might expect. The Thunderbolt had proven itself again and again. Its heavy build, powerful firepower, and remarkable resilience had made it a cornerstone of the Allied air strategy. But as the war drew to a close, the spotlight shifted to the more glamorous P-51 Mustang. The Mustang's speed, agility, and sleek design won the admiration of many, earning it the title of the best Allied fighter. In contrast, the P-47, with its bulk and unrefined appearance, found itself overshadowed. Despite its critical role in protecting bombers, clearing skies, and striking at the heart of enemy forces, the Thunderbolt often faded into the background of wartime accolades. This contrast highlighted a deep moral irony. The P-47, which had borne so much of the weight of the war, remained largely unsung in history. It had flown countless missions, endured grueling conditions, and in many cases turned the tide of battle. Yet its contributions, essential though they were often overlooked in favor of flashier aircraft. The P-51 Mustang, fast and agile, became the face of Allied air superiority, its image immortalized in popular memory. In contrast, the P-47 was relegated to the role of a workhorse, powerful but plain, its victories written in the fine print of history rather than in bold headlines. Despite this, the P-47's contribution remained vivid in the memories of those who fought with it. Pilots who had flown the Thunderbolt praised its toughness, its endurance, and its ability to take a beating and keep flying. For those who relied on it, the P-47 was more than just a weapon. It was a lifeline, an airplane that allowed them to survive another day, to complete another mission, to hold the line when everything else seemed to be failing. The legacy of the Thunderbolt was etched in the men who had trusted it, who had witnessed firsthand its capability to push through the harshest conditions and come back, mission after mission. Yet history often overlooks the unsung heroes. As the war ended and Europe slowly rebuilt, the Thunderbolt's role was obscured by the more glamorous images of warplanes like the Mustang, the Spitfire, and the Lightning. These planes, admired for their elegance and agility, became symbols of victory. But the P-47, despite its critical contributions, did not share the same place in the collective memory. In the aftermath of war, its rugged design, its size, and its heavy armament became symbols of a different kind of victory, one not won by speed or grace, but by sheer endurance. But the legacy of the P-47 was not without its turning point. The Thunderbolt's versatility and resilience had set a new standard for aircraft design, influencing not only the future of military aviation, but also how wars would be fought. Its ability to carry heavy loads, sustain damage, and provide relentless support for ground forces became the template for future aircraft. The concept of a flying tank, an aircraft that could deliver devastating firepower while enduring incredible punishment, was born in the P-47. In the years to come, military aviation would evolve, but the lessons learned from the Thunderbolt would leave their mark. Reflecting on the P-47's legacy reveals a deeper truth, that the greatest victories in history are not always the ones that receive the loudest applause. The Thunderbolt's contribution to the Allied victory in Europe cannot be overstated. It was not just a weapon of war. It was a symbol of resilience, of determination, and of the human spirit that endured against all odds. The P-47 helped secure the skies. It helped deliver victory, and it did so without ever asking for recognition. In the years that followed, the Thunderbolt would fade from the spotlight, but it would never be forgotten by those who had flown it. Its legacy was not written in the pages of history books or celebrated in grand ceremonies. It was written in the quiet, enduring memory of those who had lived through the war and understood, perhaps better than anyone, what it meant to rely on a machine that refused to break, no matter the odds. And so the P-47 will always be remembered, not just for its firepower or its role in the war, but for its lasting influence on how wars are fought. The Thunderbolt's legacy is one of endurance, of grit, and of a warplane that became more than just a weapon. It became a symbol of victory itself. What the world might never fully recognize is that, without the P-47, the road to victory would have been far longer, and the cost much greater. In the aftermath of VE Day, as the world began to breathe a collective sigh of relief, the engines of the P-47 Thunderbolts slowly went silent. The skies that had once been filled with the roar of these mighty planes now grew quiet, as the war that had defined an era came to its end. The P-47s, which had carried so much of the burden through the battles of Europe, began to fade from active service. The men who had relied on them to protect the skies, deliver devastating blows to the enemy, and provide unwavering support to ground forces found themselves in a world where the war, and their role in it, was winding down. The irony was thick. The P-47 Thunderbolt, one of the most durable and reliable aircraft of the war, slipped quietly into retirement, its contributions overshadowed by the larger, more glamorous victories. The world had seen the rise of the P-51 Mustang, the Spitfire, and the cutting-edge jets, all of which took their place in the new age of aviation. But the P-47, despite its invaluable role in the Allied victory, was often forgotten in the triumph of the moment. The planes that had borne the weight of countless missions, those that had kept the supply lines open, cleared skies of Luftwaffe fighters, and pounded enemy positions, were now left behind as a new era of warfare began to unfold. For the men who had flown these planes, however, the Thunderbolt was never forgotten. There was a deep sense of gratitude in the veteran pilots, ground crews, and engineers who had lived through the war with the P-47 at their side. They reflected on how the Thunderbolt had been more than just an aircraft. It had been a lifeline, a symbol of resilience and strength. Its heavy build, its remarkable firepower, and its ability to endure through the harshest conditions had allowed them to survive battles they otherwise could not have. It was not the most glamorous or the fastest plane, but it was the one they trusted. In every roar of its engine, in every flight across hostile skies, it was the Thunderbolt that had kept them in the fight. For those who flew it, the P-47 was more than a weapon. It was a companion, and its departure from active service left a quiet void. Though history often overlooks it, the legacy of the P-47 remained firmly etched in the memories of those who had relied on it. The planes might have been retired, their engines silenced, but the stories of what they had done, what they had enabled, remained. Veterans would tell tales of the Thunderbolt's unyielding toughness, of how it had flown through storms, absorbed enemy fire, and delivered its payload with deadly precision. In the quiet aftermath of victory, these stories kept the memory of the P-47 alive, though the world had moved on to other concerns. The Thunderbolt, it seemed, was a silent hero. Its legacy was carried not in parades or monuments, but in the quiet remembrance of those who had survived because of it. The P-47 Thunderbolt's place in history was one of quiet endurance, often overshadowed by the flashier tales of aerial dogfights and dramatic turns of battle. Yet its impact was undeniable. It had been the key to the Allies' success, providing the durability and firepower that allowed the war machine to move forward. As the P-lanes were retired, their place in the sky replaced by newer, faster designs, the Thunderbolt became a symbol of the enduring spirit of the American military in World War II. The P-47 had not won the war with speed or elegance, but with sheer resilience, a quality that became its defining trait. In the years after the war, the P-47 would fade from the public eye, its contributions gradually forgotten by those who did not live through its roar. But for the men who had flown it, for the veterans who had seen the Thunderbolt take on impossible odds and return time after time, its legacy remained alive in their stories. It was a symbol of the strength and resolve that had carried them through the war, a legacy that could never be truly forgotten. The P-47's place in history was never fully celebrated, never enshrined in the same way as the more glamorous fighters of its era. Yet its influence, its indomitable spirit, quietly continued to resonate. It had played a crucial role in victory, And while the world may never fully understand its importance, the Thunderbolt's legacy would forever echo in the hearts of those who had flown it. What began as a powerful tool for war had become a symbol of the quiet endurance that defined not only the P-47, but the very spirit of those who fought with it. The engines might have gone silent, but the Thunderbolt's legacy endured, felt in the quiet moments of reflection, but never fully celebrated. They laughed at it once. They never laughed again. This was the sentiment shared by many who had seen the P-47 Thunderbolt in its early days, an aircraft that in the eyes of many seemed an unlikely hero. Its bulky frame, its heavy armament, and its somewhat unrefined design made it an easy target for mockery. Compared to the sleek, agile fighters like the P-51 Mustang or the German Bf-109, the Thunderbolt seemed out of place. Yet as the war raged on and victory hung in the balance, it was this very aircraft, one that had once been dismissed, that would prove to be the backbone of the Allied effort. The P-47's legacy would not be written in the speed of its engine or the elegance of its form, but in the raw power of its endurance. P-47 Thunderbolt's impact on the war stands as a testament to the idea that sometimes the most significant changes come from the most unlikely sources. In the early years of the war, the Allies were scrambling for dominance in the skies. The Luftwaffe had a clear advantage, and the need for a reliable, versatile fighter was critical. When the P-47 was first introduced, its size and apparent lack of agility made it an outlier in a world obsessed with nimble dogfighters. Yet the very characteristics that had led to its initial dismissal became its greatest assets. While the faster, more agile planes could outmaneuver opponents in the heat of a dogfight, the Thunderbolt could take punishment that would have crippled any other fighter. It could absorb the hits, maintain flight, and continue its mission, proving time and again that sometimes the battle is won not by speed, but by resilience. The P-47 may not have been the most glamorous or the fastest aircraft in the sky, but its contribution to the Allied victory was undeniable. It served as a workhorse, clearing skies, escorting bombers, and carrying out ground strikes. While other planes took on more showy roles, the P-47 quietly went about its business, racking up victories without the fanfare that accompanied other aircraft. Its effectiveness was measured not by the grace of its maneuvers, but by its ability to endure and keep flying. The Thunderbolt's unassuming design allowed it to carry out mission after mission, often in the harshest conditions. It became a cornerstone of the Allied air strategy, and without it, the war would have played out very differently. The irony of the P-47's legacy cannot be overstated. The very plane that had been considered too bulky, too slow to compete with the more agile fighters, was the one that ultimately changed the course of the war. It was a lesson in the power of perseverance over flash. The P-47's victory was not won through speed or elegance, but through sheer endurance. It became clear that the ability to absorb damage, to stay in the fight despite overwhelming odds, was more important than maneuverability or elegance. In an era that prized the fastest and the sleekest, the Thunderbolt proved that power, toughness, and the willingness to keep fighting were what really mattered in the brutal reality of war. As the war reached its final stages, the P-47's role shifted from a tool of survival to a symbol of what had carried the Allies to victory: endurance. It was the unsung hero, the aircraft that no one expected to be crucial, but which proved time and again to be indispensable. In every dogfight, in every bombing run, the P-47's rugged design made it a force to be reckoned with. It became clear that the true turning point in the war wasn't just the fighters, or the tanks, but the P-47 and the determination behind it. The Thunderbolt wasn't just another weapon in the arsenal. It was a lesson in resilience, a blueprint for future military innovations, and a model of what it meant to fight through the hardest of odds. They built it to win a battle. It ended up rewriting history. The P-47 Thunderbolt, initially mocked and underestimated, had become one of the most critical players in the war. It was not the fastest, nor the most graceful, but its design, focused on endurance, durability, and power, made it one of the most influential warplanes of the conflict. It is easy to focus on the planes that captured the most attention in the press and the public imagination, but the true measure of a warplane's impact is often seen in its ability to endure and deliver when it matters most. The P proved that, in the end, endurance would always have the final word. As the engines went silent and the world began to rebuild, the legacy of the P-47 would be quietly felt in the stories of those who had flown it and in the design of future aircraft. But in that moment of victory, When the war ended and the skies were finally clear, one question remained. Would the world ever truly recognize the Thunderbolt's role in shaping the outcome of the war? The answer, like the Thunderbolt itself, would remain an enduring truth, one that would never need to be shouted, but one that would be remembered quietly in the hearts of those who knew what it had truly meant to fly it.